Today we'll be talking about Chapter 8, Section 1. And the title of it is Religion Sparks Reform. We're going to be talking about a renewal of religious sentiment known as the Second Great Awakening. We talked about the first and pointed back to Jonathan Edwards from the 1700s when America was still a colony of Great Britain. Now the Second Great Awakening was another fascinating time in American history, and we'll be talking about several famous preachers leading revivals from that time, but we'll also be talking about the social effects and implications of this and how it affected ordinary people. But first, let's talk about religious activism. The Second Great Awakening was a religious movement that swept the country in the late 1700s. Like other Christian religious movements, it taught an individual's responsibility for salvation. That Christianity was to be perceived as a relationship between the individual and their Creator. But it also taught that adherents or congregants or participants in this religion must do good for others. That religion is not just an insular activity, but that it's a community affair. And that true religion should spark an interest in helping others. And that's why I use the heading religious activism. Now, one of the famous preachers from this movement was a revivalist. Charles G. Finney was quite a charismatic speaker. He was talented at creating emotional tension within his audience. He could make a group cry. He could throw down a barn with his preaching. He could raise the fires of hell and then put them out for the crowd. He could knock them down. He'd lead revivals of up to 20,000 people or more. Again, quite a charismatic leader. Traveled the country preaching this simple message. Many of these meetings were held outdoors because there were too many people to fill a church. This was the age of revivalism, where preachers would travel the country. They're called itinerant preachers. My great-grandpa was one of these. Travel the country, preaching at different places, never staying too long at one place. Hold gatherings. Sometimes they last 4 and 5 days, and they move on to the next place. Get people super fired up, and then move on. The general social effect of this phenomena was a greater increase in church membership, but we also see a spark in social activism. And so yes, talking about religious revivalism as a cultural phenomenon. Christianity is deeply embedded into the culture of the United States. Some of that dates back even to these early days. But also it sparks this culture of helping others. And it's not the only culture that inspired this type of what we call the social gospel movement of helping others. We're going to be discussing some of these other movements as well. First, I want to show you an old woodcut drawing of Charles G. Finney knocking them dead out of the park. Here he is, throwing down a sermon, people laying down in the aisles. He might as well have been preaching old Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, telling them how God is a puppet master, how we are but spiders, and He can cut us into hell at any time that He wants. And He is perfectly justified in doing so because we are absolutely sinful and deserving of the fires and pits of hell, and that scared people to death to the point that they would fall down in the aisles. Scary stuff, really. Well, did you know, perhaps I should have been a Baptist preacher. Well, anyway, did you know that Christianity also was very popular among slaves, among African Americans? In fact, freed blacks formed their own church denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church was the first African American Christian denomination. But African American participation in Christianity dates back to the first imported slaves. Masters would teach their slaves Christianity and would use that to justify their practice. They would say, well, I'm teaching these heathens, quote heathens, Christianity, and so that justifies the fact that I'm owning these people as property. See, Southern slaves would often hear the message of Christianity as a promise of freedom. Because, well, isn't that what it is? I mean, Galatians 5:1 says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Therefore, do not let yourselves be bonded into the yoke of slavery." And if you are a slave, how do you hear that message? Because if you're a slave and you hear this message of freedom, or you hear the story of Moses going to Egypt to free the slaves, again, how would you hear that message? How would that go into your own understanding? You would hear that as a message of freedom. Now, there were many free blacks in the United States, even throughout the early 1800s, many in the North, but some in the South as well, forming their own churches and organizations. Now, it's very important to understand that Christianity is not the only religion or philosophical idea that traces its roots back to the beginning of American history. Many people like to say, well, our founding fathers were Christians. That's not quite accurate. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. So was Ben Franklin. So were many. The Enlightenment was not a Christian movement. It was mainly focused around deism. Many people who blamed Christianity for much of the ills of the Middle Ages because the church had taught people that the good life was yet to come. And the Enlightenment was focused on making the good life here. Transcendentalism was an extension of that. One of the most famous writers and thinkers of the Transcendental movement was Ralph Waldo Emerson. His most famous essay, and you can find it for free online, and I'm going to quote a bit of it for you in just a moment, was an essay on self-reliance, where he exposited, meaning he wrote about and expounded upon, the idea of individual liberty. What does it actually mean to be free? What does it actually mean to be in chains? Transcendentalism wasn't a religion. There's no transcendental church. It's a literary and a philosophical movement, emphasizing several practical activities that one can engage in to make themselves a better person. Perhaps most importantly, the essence of a simple life. The idea of decluttering. Also, that one can find a deeper meaning and experience through nature. That you can find a deeper meaning in life and experience in nature. One of his other famous essays, and I have a copy of his works, by the way, if you ever want to borrow it. But one of his other famous essays was on nature. And I've read both many times, and you should as well. And he writes about the time he spends in the wilderness. And he uses a phrase that's always stuck with me. He said, "And when I find myself in my deepest experiences far back in nature, I get caught up into a tyranny of the present." The word we use for that today is mindfulness, or present-minded, or some people use the word flow. You know, I ride mountain bikes. When you're feeling the flow, that means you're going so fast down a steep trail that all you can think about is that moment. You know, last night I was going so fast down a steep trail that dropped more than 1,000 feet in a mile. It was highly dangerous. Sure, I could be here in a cast today, but I'm not, because all I could think about was that moment. And I find that peaceful. Tomorrow I'll be going down a river that's so steep and so fast and so dangerous that if I get distracted, I'll get hurt. And so all I can think about is what I'm doing at that time. And I would bet that you have activities where you feel the same way. Things that you do that you enjoy to such a degree that you find yourself in that moment. Maybe it's with someone special. Maybe it's in a favorite activity. Whatever it is, if you can find that thing that makes you that happy, that you are actually in the present and not thinking about other things. I mean, how rare are those opportunities where we are truly only thinking about what we're doing in that moment? Again, the modern word is flow or mindfulness. He called it the tyranny of the present, and I think he just put it better than what we're putting it today. The tyranny of the present, being controlled by what you're doing at that moment. That's transcendentalism. And it is. It's not a religion. It's just an idea. Henry David Thoreau is another famous transcendentalist. Now, I've got a copy of his book, Walden, too, if you want to borrow it. He hoped to put these ideas of self-reliance into practice. And so he actually left his home in Boston, left the city. He moved into the country near a pond called Walden Pond. He built a home all by himself using hand tools, and he lived there for a number of years while he wrote his book Walden about his experiences. It's a series of essays, of ideas that he came across as he was living completely by himself off the grid. And number of essays, some on self-reliance, some on independence, some on solitude. You see, he chose to live by himself. He had neighbors. He could walk a mile or two down the road and find other people. He would go to town now and then, but he spent most of his time by himself. And when you're by yourself, what he argued is you are more real in your experiences than you would be with others. In fact, I've got a quote of the day for you in a moment, not to take away from Jade's, which I think is awesome. You see, Thoreau argued to put these ideas into practice, that if we are really going to be free as individuals, then what we need to do is not follow ideas or laws or customs that go against our conscience. And he put that into practice when he chose to refuse to pay his taxes. He was so disgusted with the fact that Andrew Jackson had kicked the Native Americans out of their homes. He said, I will not sponsor a government that will kick people out of their homes. He said this government has become tyrannical. And so he urged, instead of armed uprising that we saw in France, instead of that, he said, let's try civil disobedience. Let's try peacefully disobeying laws and see where that gets us. And of course, there's a history of civil disobedience dating back to Jesus. Gandhi tried it, freed India that way. Martin Luther King has done it. And many people have practiced civil disobedience, and Thoreau was one of these. And there's another movement I'd like to talk about, and that is Unitarianism. There's a Unitarian church over on Canuga, not too far from here. And it is a church that you go to. They meet on Sundays, just like any other church. But they are not a religion. And they'll be the first to tell you that. They don't go in there and teach anything about salvation or the afterlife. But they do talk about life, philosophy, universe, and everything, and deep ideas. And they do have this it is a spiritual movement. I've only been once, but it was fascinating. And they do a lot of community activities because they believe in the same concept of the secular side of religion. For example, your church is a great place to make friends. It's a great place to do fun things. It's also a great place to think about some big questions and sometimes think about your own life. And Unitarians stress the importance of that on a person's daily life. Everyone needs a spiritual outlet, according to the Unitarians. Everyone needs a sense of community. no matter what. And everyone needs a way to get that out. And so the Unitarians also would have agreed with the revivalists. Everyone needs to do good things for their community. And so the Unitarians were also part of this social practice, as were the Transcendentalists. So I'd like to share a quote for you from Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay on self-reliance. And he says, and I quote, "I will not live out of me. I will not see with others' eyes. My good is good. My evil is ill. I would be free. But how can I be when I take things as others please to rate them? I dare to carve my own road." That was his formal declaration of independence for his own life. We as a country are free, but what does that actually mean? And I think that's what some of these writers were trying to come up with. He defined freedom as a freedom of thought, as the freedom to be an individual. What does that mean, though? How can I be free when I take things as others please to rate them? You know, Emerson liked to ask why a lot, like any good philosopher. But I love that last phrase, I dare to carve out my own road. There was a utopian movement. I think it's kind of neat. In early American history. Remember, our country was based on the idea that we can have the good life now, that we can form an ideal community based on the tenets of democracy, and that we can have a good life on this earth. And some people took that to an extreme. But it has its roots in common sense. You know, what if we were to say, we're all good people, we're all decent humans, let's form the early college community. We'll set up some little apartments and houses around campus, and we'll all have our own little community. Because none of you are violent. None of you are criminals. None of you are thieves.
How do you know?
Well, that's, again...
We have Cameron. He's probably only going to say one.
But we've known each other now for a good year. We know enough about each other to know that we're probably not criminals. We're probably not violent. We're probably rather peaceful. In fact, perhaps we would be safer all staying here, around the campus, in our own homes, whatever, in our own places, but in a community. And that's the idea of utopia, is that we as a community can maybe set up a good place for everybody. In fact, you should watch the movie The Village. Anybody ever seen that? Yeah. Isn't it amazing? Okay? You got to watch The Village. I'm telling you. In fact, I'll show you the preview at the end of this. It's about a utopian community. It's about a group of people who have chosen to live together. And I'm not going to spoil the movie, but I'll leave it at that. And there's a mystery in the community that you're just going to have to watch the movie to find out about. And I'll tell you, eventually the utopia does fall apart, because most do. Because it's a bit unrealistic to think that we can all live in peace and harmony. Before you know it, there's going to be drama, and in most of these communities there are. One of these utopian communities is a very fascinating group called the Shakers. Now the Shakers were called the Shakers because they were a Christian congregation, and in their meetings it was not uncommon to see someone get caught up in the Spirit and shake. Okay? True story. They're called the Shakers for that very reason. Because they would get caught up in the Spirit and yeah. Well, anyway. Not only were they known for their esoteric religious practices, but they were also known as communists. Before that was even a thing. They were communists before it was cool to be a communist. They were communists before Karl Marx had even wrote about communism. They believed in sharing all of their goods and all their possessions. They didn't even believe in marriage. They believed in the equality of men and women, that they would all dwell together peacefully, and they would all dwell together platonically. and they would all refuse to fight. They believed they could create this perfect community. In fact, they would not marry, and they would not have children, meaning they lived celibate lives. And they believed that in order to grow, they would convert people to this idea, or they would adopt young children into their community. And how many do you want to guess are left?
9. About a dozen.
There are less than 10. There are actual still practicing Shakers today. However, there are less than 10 in the world today. Yeah. Some of you chose for your group project this week reform movements. Any of these would be appropriate. Perhaps you chose prominent women in the reform movement. And I think a very fascinating woman to study, even perhaps if you want to take it to the next level and do this woman for your topical project, would be Doretha Dix.
Don't go into it too much because I'm
Doretha Dix was a reformer of prisons and mental asylums. And the condition of prisons and mental asylums were deplorable at this time. And it's quite awful how people were treated in prisons. I know you may think, okay, they did bad things, they deserve to get treated badly. But we're talking inhumane. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, this is a little...
There was a lot of misunderstanding about mental illness in early American history. In fact, there's still a lot of misunderstanding about mental illness, let's be honest. And a lot of people think that those who are mentally ill, well, I'm not going to go into it today, that's a whole different story. But at this time, people associated mental illness with demon possession or a sinful life. I mean, we're still at the time where they were burning witches not that long ago. And they were, still treating many maladies in very barbaric ways. And like Jade was saying, they were taking people who are mentally ill and putting them in these, quote, asylums. But they weren't really hospitals or asylum, which means a safe place. They were places to separate the unwanted from society. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how into like sci-fi fantasy you are, but the term ogre, that's a very disgusting term. Because that was used to refer to someone who had Down syndrome. Perhaps, would be larger and stronger than the average person, but mentally handicapped. And people would call them ogres, and they would be forced out of the community and forced to live on their own. Perhaps even finding dwellings in caves or makeshift hovels. And so, yeah, Doretha Dix was one of the early reformers in this movement. But next, education. In the early 1800s, school was not compulsory. In fact, in the state of North Carolina, you are required to attend school until you're 16. But it was not once compulsory or required. In fact, most schools were so small, they were not even divided by grade. My grandmother attended school in a one-room schoolhouse with fewer than 40 students. They were all in one room. In fact, I grew up near the school, and they all attended in this one little place. No grades, just one teacher, and very simple, very small. There were no tax-supported public schools in the entire country until 1834. Pennsylvania was the very first to establish a public school system. There were no teacher training programs. Basically, anyone with a stack of books that looked intelligent could teach with no formal education. The first teacher programs in the United States began with a man named Horace Mann. And if you guys never had to do work cited the old way. I just tell you to use EasyBib, it does it for you. But the old way of doing a work cited was called the Horace Harbrace Manual. There is an actual book that you can buy that will show you how to do an appropriate work cited. It's painful. I had to do it in the days before the internet. But it was named after this individual who established the first teacher training programs. Now, by 1850, all states had some form of public education, but it did not extend beyond elementary school. All right. So, what reform did Horace Mann accomplish? Horace Harbrace? D. Very good. So today we'll be talking about Chapter 8, Section 2. And we're going to be talking all about slavery, so start the week off on a dark note. But we're also going to be talking about the abolition movement. Now, slavery was a very explosive issue. In fact, I'll be arguing throughout the next couple of weeks that this is going to be the primary cause dividing the country leading up to the Civil War. There were a number of Americans who felt that slavery was immoral and who had become a part of an ongoing movement around the world known as the Abolition movement. And so people have been working in our country, in Britain, in France, in other countries around the world to try to end the practice of slavery.
Your story, it is amazing, and in no good way.
Do you believe, sir, in justice, as you've said?
I do.
Slavery is an evil that should befall none.
I believe so.
If you truly do, then I ask, I beg, that you write my friends in the North, acquainting them with my situation, and beseeching them to forward free papers. It would be an unspeakable happiness to see my wife and my family again.
I traveled this country for the best part of 20 years. My freedom is everything. The fact that I can walk out of here tomorrow brings me great pleasure. Life doesn't mean much to anyone. It seems yours might mean a lot to a whole lot of people. But what you ask of me, sir, scares me. And I must say, I am afraid. Not just for you, but for me. I will write your letter, sir. And if it brings you your freedom, it will be more than a pleasure. It will have been my duty. Now, would you kindly hand me those shekels?
Little about abolition. The movement itself goes back much further than the American Civil War. In fact, by the 1820s, there were over 100 different abolition and anti-slavery societies. Some were advocating resettlement of slaves in Africa. Some were considering emancipation, meaning the release of slaves. And some were pushing for equality. There were a number of free blacks in the United States throughout the early 1800s. Yet, free blacks no longer considered themselves Africans. I mean, the importation of slaves dates back to 1608. Many slaves had a longer history here in America than white Americans. And so they were no more African than we are Irish. or Scottish or German or Russian or Polish. And so many freed blacks and many white Americans as well began calling for abolition or an outright outlawing of slavery in the United States. One of the most outspoken and radical abolitionists in the United States was a man named William Lloyd Garrison. He founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society, as well as the American Anti-Slavery Society. He hoped to make this a national movement. He was a newspaper publisher, founded a publication called The Liberator. In this journal, he advocated for the immediate emancipation or the freeing of slaves. As I said, there were a number of freed blacks in the United States working for the cause of abolition. David Walker was a rather controversial abolitionist. He advised blacks to fight for their freedom. He would have argued that slavery is an act of violence and that it must be met with violence. In fact, he once said, "A man who is not willing to fight for his freedom deserves the chains he wears." Now, not all advocated violence. In fact, there were a number of freed blacks living in the South, worked as day laborers or skilled workers in factories and towns and cities. However, even in the North, freed blacks would only be given the lowest paying jobs, forced into segregated neighborhoods, into a second-class form of citizenry. Frederick Douglass is considered a hero to many. He had been born a slave. He had been taught to read at an early age, in secret by the owner's wife. Had he been caught learning how to read, he could have been beaten or even worse, because it was not permissible for a slave to learn how to read or write. Douglass became a skilled carpenter, to the point where his owner would hire him out to different contractors on construction projects. This allowed him a degree of freedom and made his escape possible. And when he escaped, he became friends with William Lloyd Garrison, the famous emancipationist. He was asked to lecture for the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he traveled throughout free states to raise awareness about the need for abolition and about the cruelty of slavery. He also founded his own newspaper publication called the North Star. He believed that abolition could be reached through political action. But now, Frederick Douglass believed that abolition, or the end of slavery, could occur through political action, that through peaceful means we could achieve an end to slavery. And he had a point. Historically, many European countries ended slavery peacefully, and he had hoped to believe this could be accomplished here through political action. However, the trouble in the United States is there was a lot of money to be made on the slave trade. The population of slaves in the United States increased from 1.2 million in 1810 to, in fact, by the time of the American Civil War, there were over 4 million slaves living in the United States. Throughout the 1700s, most slaves had been recent arrivals. generally working on small farms. However, by the early 1800s, there were very large plantations in the South, huge farming operations, with sometimes hundreds of slaves. I have another book about a Cherokee-owned plantation by a man named James Vann. Lived in Chatsworth, Georgia. He owned over 100 slaves. He was the largest Cherokee plantation slave owner. Over 100 slaves. He had absolute control over these people. There were cases of slaves trying to escape. He could do whatever he wanted to them to punish them. There was a case of 2 slaves who stole money from him in order to try to escape. He burned them alive in front of the rest of his slaves. Now, even among slave owners, that would have been considered cruel. However, it was not considered illegal. Absolute power. The slaves lived in a separate row house where they all lived together in bunks. In fact, the plantation still exists. It's a historical site you can go visit. On these plantations, men, women, and children would work all day, every day. They would be beaten if they did not work fast enough, if they stopped when they weren't allowed. They had very little time for food, very few breaks for rest. In fact, being a plantation slave was considered one of the cruelest ways to live. Like was said, if you got to work in the big house, life was a little better. Perhaps you got to cook or clean for the owner, but you were still owned as property, and you were still not free to come and go as you please. Now, there was a demand in southern cities for black slaves who had skills, marketable skills like carpentry or blacksmithing or working in factories. Some enslaved blacks could even hire themselves out on the side as a skilled worker. Some slave owners actually used slaves to work in factories. And generally, slavery within southern cities was less cruel than that of the plantations. And that's why that phrase, sold downriver, referring to down the Mississippi into some of the plantations in the deep south, was considered a cruelty. Remember David Walker, who argued that slaves should rise up against their masters. Some did, such as Nat Turner. He was a preacher. He led a slave rebellion. In fact, slaves from several different plantations managed to temporarily win their freedom. They rose up and killed the owners of these plantations and fled into the wilderness to escape. A posse was rounded up and hunted these escaped slaves like savages. In fact, about 200 of these escaped slaves were killed in retaliation. In fact, here is a newspaper clipping from Nat Turner's uprising in Virginia. Notice the bias you see in this newspaper. In fact, how did these pictures tell the story of these escaped slaves? Yeah, it says horrid massacre in Virginia. And the journalist here has depicted escaped slaves savagely murdering white Americans. And here you see this image of, what the journalist wanted you to think of as a heroic posse hunting down these, quote, murderers. But of course, that's not really how it played out, right? A preacher named Nat Turner believed that slaves should be treated as human beings. Decided to take matters into his own hands. The law was not serving these people. If we think of this like like John Locke, that government is a social contract, that a government should be of the people, by the people, for the people, the government was certainly not helping the slave, was certainly not representing them. And so Nat Turner took matters into his own hands. And this is how they were treated. Following Nat Turner's rebellion, now the reaction to Nat Turner's uprising throughout the South was powerful. He would have been considered a terrorist, even though we think of him today as a man trying to help people win their freedom. The Virginia legislature debated abolition, was discussing the idea of outlawing slavery within their state. The motion was not passed. There were only a handful of legislatures that were even open to the idea of abolition. And after Nat Turner's rebellion, most Southern legislatures decided not to attempt to end slavery at all. In fact, they wanted greater controls on slaves. Now, the time we refer to as antebellum, that's what we call the South prior to the American Civil War. And so in many ways, Nat Turner's rebellion ended the debate on slavery, at least in Virginia, because many Southern whites, responding to the propaganda like we saw in the newspapers, were concerned and wanted a tighter degree of control. In fact, many Southern states created slave codes to tighten limits on blacks. Slaves were not permitted outside of their plantation without written permission from their owner. In fact, freed blacks were required to carry identification proving that they were a freed black. And so they lost many rights, as well as slaves. Now, pro-slavery advocates would use the Bible, would try to claim that the Bible permitted slavery, would misinterpret passages to claim that blacks were a part of a cursed race of people, and that people were justified in looking down upon them. Though slaves heard the message of Moses and took hope, slave owners read the passages where it says clearly, slaves obey your masters. Do you know how many times that phrase occurs in the Bible, both New and Old Testament? Slaves, obey your masters. Have you ever come across that verse? It's not really comforting, but yes, you will come across that verse not once, not twice, it's not just the Old Testament. You can't just write it off. No, Paul ends every letter in the epistles. Slaves, obey your masters. Some try to interpret that as slave meant house servant at the time. That's not how slave owners interpreted that. And so they would interpret that as justification. Slaves would be forced to attend church with their masters. They would be required to sit on the opposite side, but they would hear the same message from the same preacher, who would on a regular basis cite those verses to uphold the institution of slavery. Slave owners would also attempt to justify their practices through what is now referred to as the myth of the happy slave. For example, if you watch Gone with the Wind, Mammy, the slave who cared for the children in Gone with the Wind, would have been the stereotypical, quote, happy slave, treated as a member of the family, living in the big house, caring for the children. A beloved member of their family in Gone with the Wind. But most slaves, as we know, worked on the plantations and were beaten or killed or maimed if they did not do exactly as the owner required. After Nat Turner's rebellion, Southern congressmen issued a gag rule which limited or prevented debate on the issue of slavery. And in fact, this deprived individual abolitionists the right to be heard on the issue of slavery. And so, in closing, just by way of review, I wanted to ask you, how did Southern whites respond to Nat Turner's rebellion? Very good. Strengthened slave codes. So today we'll be talking about Chapter 8, Section 3. And the title of this is Women and Reform. And this could have been one of your group subjects that you chose. We're going to be talking about the early women's rights movement in American history today, including suffrage, which is the right to vote. But we'll also be talking about slavery as well as women's expected roles in the family. And so as we talk about the women's rights movement, it has been a movement towards greater equality by gender dating back to the earliest parts of our country. And so we'll start by talking about the family. In early American history, there was a culture of domesticity. And that's what I mean by cult there. Culture of domesticity. Domesticity, the root word of that is domestic, meaning home. And it was the idea, the culture, the way of life, that a woman's expected role in life was to care for her family at home. And that housework and childcare should be the primary roles of a woman throughout her life. In fact, your book references a marriage manual from the early 1800s. And it says that the only chemistry a woman needs to know is how to boil water. The only geography a woman needs to know is how to get around her house. Can you imagine how limiting that would be? Now, this is not a written law that women have to be stay-at-home mothers, that women had to care for their families. But it was a cultural expectation that this was to be the norm for a woman's life. Of course, not all women married, though most did. Some women could find work in the factories. Lowell, Massachusetts was a textile factory. It was the first of its kind in the United States. Hired primarily women. Because by hiring women, they could pay women half as much as they would have to pay a man. And there was no law against that. For the exact same job, they could pay a woman half what they could pay men. Women had very few legal rights. They were not allowed to vote. They could not sit on juries. They did not even have legal guardianship of their own children. So this idea of a nation of the people, by the people, for the people was rather hypocritical, if you think about it. our founding fathers, keyword there, fathers, because we're talking about a patriarchal system, rebelled against the British government because they were being taxed without representation. And yet, aren't we doing the same to women here? In fact, a married woman's property belonged legally to her husband, as well as guardianship of the children. What a woman earned belonged to her husband. If her husband passed away, the cultural norm was for the husband's nearest male relative to care for the widow and her children. And if there was an unmarried male relative, that person would make that family his own. And that was the norm. That was the idea. That was the expectation. And it was all based on the religion and culture of the time. There are many passages in religious text central to American culture, I'm being careful with my words there, that say a woman must be submissive to her husband. It says that over and over again in various religious texts, not just one religion, but many that were prevalent at that time. And so this idea of domesticity. Did you know it was considered inappropriate for a woman to address a man in public? We're not talking about Sharia law. We're talking about Christian fundamentalism. Did you know it was considered inappropriate for a woman to speak in public? In fact, that was considered sinful. 1 Corinthians 11:7, a woman is to remain silent in the churches. If she has a question, let her ask her husband at home. Do you know it was considered inappropriate for a woman to hold positions of authority over men? And how much misogyny have we heard about this recent presidential election? Again, how many comments in reference to gender have we heard about presidential candidates? Now, we're going to be talking about the women's rights movement. And I hope some of you chose this for your group stuff. And I'm excited to hear some of your topical projects on the same subject. You see, there were quite a few women who didn't agree with this standard of living, who challenged this way of life. There's a woman worth knowing about. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott formed the first American Women's Rights Society. And so we'll be talking about some of the achievements of these women. Now, this is a caricature, meaning a cartoon, a political cartoon, a work of satire, meaning they're poking fun at what these women are trying to accomplish. You see here George Washington. Seated at his right hand is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. At his left, Susan B. Anthony. And in this heavenly throne. You see a lot of images like this of Washington in D.C., in fact. And we'll see some of these when you go on tour of D.C. But this one here, talking about the Women's Suffrage Association. Suffrage means the right to vote. And we'll come back to the right to vote in just a moment. But first, abolition. Yesterday we were talking about the movement to end slavery, known as abolition. Many women were a part of this movement as well. For example, Sarah and Angelina Grimke were two daughters of a southern slave owner who, despite being raised on the idea that slavery was a biblically ordained institution, when they became adults, they grew up and realized that slavery was wrong, even though everything they had ever been taught was contrary to that idea. They just knew deep down in their hearts that slavery was wrong. And they became a part of the abolition movement, even though their father was a slave owner. Can you imagine how much courage that would have taken for these two girls to stand up to their father and say, "Your way of life is evil"? I don't know if I have those kind of guts to stand up and say, "Mom, Dad, what you are doing is wrong, and I'm going to work to stop you." Can you imagine? That's what these young girls did. They did that at a time when it was considered inappropriate for a woman to even speak in public. And they decided to challenge their own father and commit their lives to working against what he did for a living. Some men supported women reformers. Others denounced them, calling them all kinds of nasty names, because women would have been seen as acting very inappropriately to try to publicly protest anything. Because, again, the idea of womanhood at this time was an idea of submissiveness. And here these women were challenging the status quo. Many women became involved in the temperance movement. Temperance was the movement to outlaw the drinking of alcohol. In fact, it was the Women's Christian Temperance Union which eventually became successful in the passage of the 18th Amendment, which made prohibition constitutional law. But I want you to think about why women would be so involved in the temperance movement. It wasn't unheard of for women to drink at this time, but it was less common. Generally, liquor was considered a man's drink at that time. And it wasn't uncommon for men to come home drunk. And it wasn't unheard of for drunk men to beat their families. Yet, it was considered unheard of, unlawful for women to divorce their husbands. Women had no legal grounds for leaving their families at this time. And so, what can women do? Legally, they had very little power. And so they began to work to outlaw one of the causes of their misery, and that was alcohol. And the American Temperance Society was founded in 1826. Because you see, as this engraving from 1840 shows, a family driven to despair by alcohol, poverty and misery, depravity, with the drunken deadbeat dad. That's all too familiar in today's culture. But notice a couple other things. Women were expected to wear bonnets. Does anybody know why women were expected to wear bonnets? They had to have a head covering. You mean women had to have their head covered? Their full body from neck to foot covered?
People thought they were being provocative.
Yes, exactly. Now, what culture do we talk bad about when they cover themselves today?
America, a sacred place where everyone dresses in the color of magic and the roads are paved with gold. Monday, June 21st, 1847. When Adenora moved to America years ago, she promised that I would join her there someday. But by my faith, I am thinking now, I may never make it. Nearly 2 months we've been at sea. Scarce is food and water scarcer still. Many of the passengers have not fared well. Today alone, the crew put 2 people out to sea. Frightened I am, but I thank the sweet Lord each day for sending me Sean. He has helped me to endure this awful voyage.
Hey, here. You're safe. I drank some earlier. Is something wrong?
I miss my mind. I keep wondering if the famine's getting worse for them.
No worries, Mary. You'll see them again before long. You'll arrive in America and find work. You will, with all your skills for reading and writing. In no time at all, you'll have all the money you need to bring them over.
Made it past the doctor, did you? Good for you. Some of the people are sending back. Imagine having to make that voyage again.
Have you found your aunt yet?
No.
Stay right here. Mary Driscoll, meet my uncle, Patrick Quinn.
How do you do, Mary?
Really shy she is when first you meet. Has she not come yet?
Oh, I'm certain she'll be along soon.
If she hasn't come by now, Mary, she likely won't. You must come to my uncle's tavern with us.
We'll put a notice in the paper. Your aunt will see it, and then she'll come and get you.
Well, thanks all the same, but I'll be fine waiting here.
All right, then. Goodbye, Mary.
Goodbye, Sean. And thank you so much. As we left the dock, I recalled the last words my ma spoke to me before I left. She said, "The blessed Lord never closes one gate without opening another." Clinging to her words was I, as I took the first steps into my new life in America.
So, again, Sarah and Angelina Grimke. By this time, they were older. But you still see them wearing this traditional garb, very, kind of puritanical clothing. Only the face could be seen. But they spent their life and career working for the abolition of slavery. Educational opportunities for women in the 1800s were very rare. Now, a wealthy woman from a wealthy family could gain access to private tutors and gain entry to some universities. But there were rarely opportunities for the common woman past elementary school. In fact, there were very few elementary schools in the United States until after the American Civil War. However, some of the very first women's colleges opened up in the early 1800s. For example, Emma Willard opened Troy Female Seminary in 1821. Mary Lyon founded Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, both for studying religious studies. Yet, colleges were strictly segregated by gender. The very first coeducational college was Oberlin College. At first only admitted 4 women. In fact, though there's not as much press about it, the movement to desegregate by gender was just as slow and controversial as the movement to desegregate by race. And of course, African American girls had very, very few opportunities to get a good education. Women's health was also deplorable. The very first clinic for women was opened up by a woman named Elizabeth Blackwell. Would be a fascinating woman to study for one of your projects. You see, understanding of women's health was very primitive at this time. It was believed that the woman was responsible for the gender of the child, which in fact it's the male. It was generally assumed it was the woman's fault if infertility was an issue. And infertility was an acceptable grounds for divorcing of a wife, even though there was no proof that it was the man or the woman. Generally, women, like men as well, lived very unhealthy lives. Nutrition was rather poor. Living conditions, especially in cities, were rather unsanitary. And a national survey of women's health, the first of its kind conducted by Catherine Beecher, found that most women were unhealthy. But even the clothing of the time was very prohibitive for a woman to be comfortable or to be active. For example, Angelina Bloomer was extremely controversial and became legendary for designing a style of clothing that allowed women to ride a horse. She made pants. Did you know it was considered uncouth for a woman to wear pants? Of course, they had to wear these long dresses that covered up everything, even the ankles. But she designed bloomers. I'm going to show them to you. This is what earned Angelina Bloomer a bad name. But the ladies' bloomers could split down the middle, allowing a woman to ride a horse in a traditional way. Of course, they were covered around the middle. They were essentially large pants.
Parachute pants.
Yeah, big pants, big poofy things with many, many layers. Because without these, a woman would have to ride a horse side saddle. And you can never ride a horse side saddle at faster than a walk. To canter a horse side saddle would be very dangerous. And so women were limited in their mobility because of their dress. In fact, women were limited in their activity because of their dress as well. You don't have to do this, but just for fun, put your hands on your ribs, press in. Now, take a deep breath. What do you notice?
Hard.
Yeah, it's hard. What are we simulating? Can you say it? A corset. Very good. So what a corset does is it creates an hourglass figure. We're not all shaped like an hourglass, but that was considered the ideal shape at that time. And so women would put corsets on to constrict their torso to give them the hourglass shape. Not unlike the practice of Chinese foot binding. Anybody familiar with the practice of Chinese foot binding? The quote, the standard of beauty at that time was that a woman's foot would resemble the shape of a lotus, a flower. And so to make that happen, they would bind a young girl's feet from a very young age so that as they grew, they would form into the shape of a flower. Now this prevented them from being able to walk very far. It's why you see walking like this sometimes in anime. Because of the tradition, it dates back to the tradition of Chinese foot binding. So the women would have to walk almost tiptoed because it's the only way they could move. We weren't as extreme as binding feet, but the corset hinders a person's breath to the point that women would faint. That's why you hear in old stories of a woman growing faint. Or you look pale. Well, sure, she looks pale. She's not getting any blood to her head because this thing's cutting her off. Anyway.
Mary, I have a letter.
Oh, it's from Aunt Nora, finally. She's in Lowell, Massachusetts. Oh, it says that she never received a letter telling her what ship I'd be arriving on. Oh, and she can't wait to see me.
Mary, my Mary. Bless us and save us, quiet one. Tis a pure joy to behold your angelic face. I've been lonely as a church mouse these past 6 years, with only my students for company. But now that you're here, I'll be lonely no more.
She teaches school. 'Twas Aunt Nora who taught me to read and write.
'Twill be hard. Life in the acre is not what you'd call pleasant. But we'll care for each other and make the best of it, eh?
Anything is better than what we left back in Ireland.
'Tis true, then. The famine is worse.
People are starving to death with no hope for relief.
Worry not, quiet one. There's plenty of food here in America. And though the work is hard and the Yankees do tend to look down upon us, at least there is work and plenty of it. The mills are always looking to hire, especially Irish girls. They don't tend to complain about things the way the Yankee girls do. And plenty of Irish lads have found work as well. Building a new canal they are.
Are they still hiring?
Indeed. Always looking for a strong back. More potatoes, Mary?
Please. Ta.
My little quiet one. Still the first to listen and the last to speak. Take heart, child. For in America, every voice is heard. Sometimes Yankee ears need a loud voice to get them moving.
Spinning room 3. This is where you work. One of the girls will teach you your tasks. Now be careful not to daydream. Pay strict attention so that you don't hold up the line.
He's a real charmer, that Mr. Fowler. So stiff and straight, sometimes I think he swallowed a crowbar. What's your name?
Mary Driscoll.
I'm Annie Clark. I'll be teaching you your tasks. First things first, though. We'll pin up this lovely hair of yours. Keep it from getting caught in the machines. Your main task will be to tend to the bobbins. Stay alert at all times. Make sure your fingers don't get caught in the machines. Don't worry. I won't leave you alone until you're fully at ease, all right? Good. Well, I'll show you how it's done. Your hand. That's it. You got it?
Now, the women's rights movement first gained national attention at the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights in 1848. The movement was somewhat about economic opportunity, providing more opportunities for women to work outside the home. But it was also about equality. The idea of recognizing the need for equality by gender. And one of the great accomplishments of this convention was a Declaration of Sentiments. It was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. It was based on the idea that equality for all, or that created equal in the sight of God, as the Declaration states, doesn't mean just all men are created equal. In fact, one of the agreements of this convention was that men and women were created equally. And that, though controversial, and though it was debated heavily in this convention, women should have the right to participate in public issues. Because isn't that fundamental? Isn't that from the First Amendment? That we have the right to meet in public peacefully, that we have the right to seek redress of grievances publicly and peacefully, that we have the right to speak out publicly what is on our mind, and yet women were being withheld these very same rights that are stated in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And of course, suffrage, the right to vote for women. Again, even in this convention, it was hotly contested. It was very controversial. The vote to pass suffrage as a goal of the women's rights movement was very narrowly passed. And so in 1848, the movement to gain the right to vote for women was begun. Does anybody know when that movement would finally be successful at a national level? 1920. When the 19th Amendment would be passed. Guys, 72 years. It took 72 years from the Seneca Falls Convention, when it was agreed upon that suffrage would be a goal, until finally it was achieved. Can you imagine what these women must have faced in working towards this goal? Can you imagine the type of hostility that women would have faced by daring to suggest they had the same rights as men? Can you imagine the types of crude comments these women must have had to endure? The types of attacks on their reputation that these women must have had to endure? And regardless of your politics, have you noticed the types of comments that a female candidate for president has had to endure? Again, put your politics aside. Just think of the types of comments about a woman's gender that this person has had to endure. Whether you agree with her or not, she's had guts to face those types of comments. One of my favorite ladies in American history is a former slave named Sojourner Truth. She traveled the country preaching about not only women's rights, but about the movement to end slavery. She's a hero to many. One of the gutsiest ladies I've ever seen or read about. I think I heard one of the groups talking from her famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" Who's doing that one? Anybody? Yeah.
I'll do, miss.
Sean!
So, how was your first day of work in America?
Well, my ears are ringing and my feet are sore.
As are mine. But at least we have jobs.
You found work?
On the canal. Set me to working straight away, they did. Filthy back-breaking work the foreman promised. I says to myself, such work is nothing new to we Irish. Will you help me write a letter to me uncle? I want to tell him I won't be coming back to Boston.
Of course I will. And you should stay with Aunt Nora and I.
Oh, I wouldn't want to be any trouble.
Oh, 'tis no trouble. You and your uncle took me in when I had no place to stay.
Aunt Nora's house is small. It'll be awfully crowded.
Ah, such conditions are nothing new to we Irish.
How do you like working in the mill so far?
Oh, suits me just fine.
That's right. You Irish girls love the long hours, and the heat, and the noise.
Clarissa?
And when the mill agents ask you to work longer hours with fewer breaks, I suppose that'll suit you just fine as well.
Leave her alone, Clarissa. She just started work here.
There was a time when the mill girls worked 10-hour days and could sit and rest. No girl worked more than 2 looms.
Those days will return, Clarissa, but we must be united in our demands. And that means everyone, including the Irish girls.
It would be nice to work 10-hour days.
It would still be that way if you Irish had stayed in Ireland where you belong.
That's enough.
Where we belong, I wanted to ask Clarissa if she would stay where she belonged if the only food to eat was 2 meager bowls of soup a week, where people reduce themselves to eating seaweed and tree bark to keep from starving. But I held my tongue.
Hopefully soon I'll have enough to send for Mom and Dad.
I know you miss them terribly. They'll be here before you know it.
Sean!
I'm all right.
Dear boy, what happened?
On our way home from work, some Yankee boys took to harassing us. Cowards threw stones.
I'll get the doctor.
I'm all right, Aunt Nora. I'll get there. Stop, you can be sure.
No, Sean. You mustn't let them draw you into a fight.
They started it.
You can't be getting into trouble. What if you lose your job over it? I think it's best that we just stay quiet. Keep to ourselves. We Irish are like family. Especially here in America.
So I wanted to share some current global injustices against women. Currently, women have gained the right to vote in all countries except for Saudi Arabia and the Vatican City. These are the only countries that currently allow men, yet not women, the right to vote. Now, I want to be careful to point out not all countries allow the right to vote for any citizens, but these are the only ones currently that allow men but not women. In Yemen, a country near Saudi Arabia, women are not permitted to leave the house without permission from their husbands. Globally, women still do not have equality. Pay inequity is still a problem, even in our country. But yet, if it weren't for the social advocacy of brave women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, how would our country be different? If women were not willing to stand up for their rights, would things be any different today? Because we went as a society for thousands of years treating women far differently than we treated men. And yet today it is considered inappropriate to do so publicly. Yet, subtly, we still treat women differently than we do men, though it's inappropriate today to do so publicly. And yet, if women do not stand up, if they continue to tolerate misogyny, which means a bias towards men, it will continue to remain the same. All right, and today we'll be talking about Chapter 8, Section 4, and the title of this is The Changing Workplace. We're going to be talking about how a growing industrial workforce faced challenges arising from manufacturing in the factory system. And first I've got a little clip that's going to introduce our section. Now what we're looking at here is an old charcoal engraving dating back to the early 1800s. It's a drawing of a factory. You see the transportation relied on horsepower. The heat relied on this smokestack, but I would assume the power source came from moving water, or it could have come from steam from the smokestack. Generally these were dirty places where people were forced to work long hours and had very few rights as workers, rights that we now take for granted today, which were the result of a labor movement dating back to the early part of American history. And so really this is what we'll be talking about today, life at work in early American history. Now, first off, industry. Many manufactured goods were produced in people's homes. There were weaving factories where large-scale production could take place, but these were still few and far between in the United States in the early 1800s. A lot of our production relied on the cottage industry, where families would do work and then sell that work out for profit to entrepreneurs who would purchase these goods made from people's homes and then sell them at a profit. However, the factory system was changing American life. Investors like Francis Cabot Lowell, who opened the first weaving factory in Massachusetts, eventually did so well that he was able to open 8 new factories, hiring 6,000 employees throughout Massachusetts and New England. And so I just wanted to show you an example of the cottage industry. This family might be a farm family living in New England. They might grow food that they need not only to survive, but perhaps to even sell in excess for profit. But as a side income, they might also produce cloth, homespun from cotton. Perhaps they've grown on their own farm, or perhaps a company has contracted out with them to give them the cotton, and this lady will turn it into cloth by hand. And that's the way that much of our clothing was made prior to the factory system. But these early factories excelled at producing items that people could not make themselves. In fact, this is part of an aspect of civilization known as specialization. You have specialized skills, things that you can do that no one else can do. And as you're growing and as you're maturing, you are developing those skills. And you are excelling at them, and you are practicing those things until you are so good at those things that you can make money off of them. Now, the educational system around factories relied on a very old method, the apprenticeship. A young person could hire themselves out to a factory or a craft or a trade and learn from an experienced artisan. It might take years, but they would learn from that person how to do that craft or that trade. That's called an apprenticeship, where you learn that specialized skill from a master, someone who has done it for quite some time. Now, perhaps years later, you've been working under this master. You've developed many of the skills necessary to carry on the trade that you have employed yourself with. Perhaps you might become a journeyman. Maybe you've opened up a news shop under the guise of your master. Maybe you've begun to take on responsibilities at your work, and you can now be trusted. Though you haven't quite mastered whatever it is you're employed with. But then maybe after 10 years, maybe it could take some time, you might eventually be as good as the person that taught you. And that would be the process of learning a skilled trade. This ancient process is still in use today in many trades and professions. For example, maybe you want to learn to work on cars. You can take automotive classes here at the college. You could begin your apprenticeship. You could take a few classes. Excellent. You're going to maybe even get enough certification to go to work as a mechanic. But until you've been practicing for some time, under the watchful eye of someone who's been doing it for a very long time, you're not going to know everything about a car. There's certainly so many cars, it's going to take you a long time, and you're going to need help, ideally experienced help. And so again, this system is not obsolete. You'll still find it in many different industries. Well, factories, the factory system, revolutionized industry. The cost of household items dropped because things could be produced much quicker, but also unskilled workers begin to replace artisans. Now, for example, let's say you want to be a blacksmith. I met a blacksmith this summer. It was really cool. He could turn an axle. He showed me. He had this axle, a car axle. He turned into a knife. It's a beautiful knife. I asked if I could see it. He brought it out. He showed it to me. I was like, wow, that's really nice. How much you charge for that? He said, that one is about $600. And so I was like, oh, whoa, here you go. You can have it back. I thought, okay, $20. Here you go. Here's a knife. Great. No, $600. I was like, wow, what else you got? And he's got, well, I've got this. I found this really neat deer antler in the woods, and I turned it into the handle of a knife. I'm like, oh, cool. Same thing. Okay, what is it? Whoa, way too expensive. All right. Well, this guy had been doing that trade for a very long time. He would certainly qualify as a master of his trade in a skilled profession, because there's a lot of skill required to the profession of being a blacksmith. Now, the factory system changed many of these aspects. For example, we're going to continue watching our story about the young girl and the boy from Ireland, and you saw her learn the trade of working a sewing loom in the course of a day. So whereas maybe you're going to be a mechanic or a blacksmith, and those skills might take years to develop, you could learn a sewing loom in a day. Maybe you want to be a lawyer. Maybe it's going to take you a decade of study from now until the time you start practicing. And you'll be a very skilled lawyer in a very specialized field. Or you can go work at Hardee's, and you can learn the whole trade in a few days. Nothing against those who work at Hardee's. Somebody's got to flip our burgers. But again, you can learn how to cook a burger, how to pull fries, and how to bake desserts, how to mix sodas, and how to run a register. You can run all that in a few days or even in a week. When I worked in the restaurant industry, by my second summer, I was managing a restaurant. Okay? I'm not bragging on myself. I'm just telling you it does qualify as unskilled labor. The factory system, in many ways, gave more opportunities for unskilled workers as mass production replaced the old system. For example, you can mass produce tools that would once have been made by hand by very skilled blacksmiths, and now they can be made using the factory system and churn out 1,000 a day. It's just how it is. You know, for example, the skill to make a Rolls-Royce automobile, a handmade car, is incredible. These people have been doing that all their lives. But yet, there is a factory in Iowa that can produce a John Deere tractor the size of this classroom, one every single day.
Wow.
Now, the factory is huge, and it employs a lot of people. I had a buddy who worked there. It's huge. The whole factory is bigger than this campus. But it can make one of those giant combine tractors every single day. But then compare that to the skill that it takes to make one Rolls-Royce. That one person who knows every tool and who crafted every part of that by hand. Which is more efficient? The tractor. Perhaps which is more beautiful? Okay, the Rolls-Royce. Whatever. But this, of course, replaced and made obsolete many skilled professions. Here's an old painting depicting Lowell, Massachusetts. The main thing I wanted to point out here is that you see, though it's kind of unrealistic of a drawing, the factory is located right near the river because that was the source of power in 1834.
It's all right. Sometimes I have to slap myself to keep from napping. There's going to be a meeting Friday night at my boarding house. I was hoping you'd attend.
What kind of meeting?
A group of girls are working on a labor newspaper. We're hoping to gather enough support so that we can approach the company to ask for shorter work days.
I heard that the company keeps a list.
I know. And with the names of the girls they say are troublemakers.
They give that list to other companies to prevent you from finding work.
Yes, but if they put us all on the list, then they'd have no one left to work the mills now, would they?
I'd love to help you, surely I would, but I have my mom and dad to think about. Until I earn enough money for their passage, I can't be risking my job.
How many times do we have to tell you to pin your hair up? You two get back to your machines. You clean out these gears. Get back to work.
Now, I want to take you inside the mill that this lady was working in. It's called the Lowell Mill in Massachusetts. Most of the workers in this mill were unmarried girls from farms. Some were immigrants, like the lady you've seen in the movie here. They would be under strict control of a factory supervisor. Their lives were regimented. They lived in boarding houses owned by the factory. They had curfews. They had expectations about their behavior, even expectations about how they wore their hair and dressed. Now, owners preferred to hire women because they could pay them lower wages than men. Yet, women still came to these factories in large numbers, and that for every woman that burned out and quit, there were more that could replace them. Because the pay was better than the alternative. Factory pay paid more than teaching. It paid more than sewing. Working in a factory could yield you a better income than bringing home homespun cotton to turn into cloth. It paid more than domestic work. So a young woman could stand to earn an income working in one of these factories whereas she couldn't earn nearly as much money in any other form of occupation that was available to her at that time. Though the attrition rate, or the burnout rate, was severe. It's the same with many low-skilled occupations today. You know, maybe you're thinking about your first summer job. Maybe you want to work at Ingalls. They have a stack of applications. Your interview process will be short and sweet. Do you want the job? Have you killed anybody? Have you stolen from anybody? Congratulations, you're hired. It's going to be a short interview. I don't mean to burst your bubble. Been there, done that. You'll probably burn out. You'll get sick of it after a few months. You'll start to complain about your boss. Your coworkers are going to be rude. There's going to be drama there. And you'll eventually quit. And again, not to burst your bubble, unless you've really stood out in some way, that's it. No tears shed on either side. Again, nothing personal. That's just the life of unskilled labor. Now, perhaps maybe you can work your way up, become some sort of manager, acquire some degree of responsibility, and move your way up. I have friends who have started out in the restaurant industry and now manage restaurants. Again, I have friends who started out and now have positions of responsibility. But most of you will burn out and quit if you go into an unskilled labor industry. And they expect that. That's why they don't treat you well. Because they expect that you won't last long. Because they can teach someone else your job within a day or two. And so in reality, they don't need you. They need someone, but it doesn't matter who. And so this type of labor is frustrating. And yes, we still have the service industry today. And yes, it is still frustrating to work in that field. Been there, done that. Most of these girls only work there a few years and then they burn out. But it does provide a neat opportunity. And for many of these girls, it's the first time they've ever worked away from home. And some of these girls are the very first girls that have ever worked in their community outside of home and have ever had some degree of freedom. Even though their lives are regimented, for many, this represented a neat opportunity. But next I want to talk about conditions in Lowell. And I hope that you never have to see these types of conditions. 12-hour days. 12-hour days. That means most days sun up to sundown. While slavery has been outlawed, wage slavery replaced it. While slavery has been outlawed, wage slavery has replaced it. Conditions in these factories were deplorable. They were typically very hot with poor ventilation, and that was by design, because the owners of these factories realized that by keeping their factories hot and humid, it was good for the cloth. It doesn't matter if that causes respiratory illness and infections. It doesn't matter if that causes misery of working in an oven, discomfort or illness. As conditions continued to deteriorate, the first strike in the United States occurred, ironically, at the first factory in the United States. A strike is a work stoppage. You know, maybe you're going to get sick of working at Ingalls and you're going to say, I'm not coming in anymore. And the manager's going to go, that's all right. I've got a stack of applications in the back. Have a nice life. Maybe you're going to convince your friends to quit. And be like, shipping and receiving is done with you. We're out. We're not unloading your trucks anymore. They're going to be like, whatever. We got a whole stack in the back. We'll have people to replace you tomorrow. But maybe, just maybe, enough of you will quit to cause an uproar. Doubtful, because people need those jobs. Nobody works at Ingalls because they love Ingalls. People work at Ingalls because they need the work. You know, my mother-in-law works at Ingalls. I've worked in grocery, and I'm sure many of you will. Not a thing wrong with it. I'm just telling you, the conditions are not always the happiest. And it's the same at this factory. You see, if one worker quits, if that young lady had quit after getting her hair caught and how she was treated, the guy wouldn't have cared. Stack of applications. 800 girls walked off of this factory. That's when it began to matter. That's when it made the history books. The first strike was over a cut in their pay. It's bad enough they have to work 12-hour days in a hot, humid factory under rigid control. But now their pay is cut for no other reason than that the owner wanted to increase his profits. The next strike was over an increase in their rent. Yeah, because they lived in boarding houses that were owned by the factory. So the first strike in 1834 was over a cut in their pay. And the jerk had the audacity to increase their rent. Why? Because they could make more money that way if they paid their workers less and they charged them more for rent. It was all about profit. And again, these people were unskilled workers. They might as well have been machines to the owner. Didn't even think of them as people. In both cases, in both strikes in early American history, the company won. All they had to do was fire the leaders of the strike, invite the others to come back, and tell them plainly, we don't care if you come back. We'll find somebody else. You want to be an unskilled worker? These are the types of conditions you'll have to face. And this led to the first Labor Reform Association. Because you see, if this had been in the end of the story, you're having your conversation with your friends at work and you're going, man, this sucks. And your friend goes, yeah. And then you go, well, I need the work. Okay. But then after a while, you get sick of being treated badly and you say, I'm out. And the manager goes, whatever. In this case, I just want you to understand, 800 people walked off the job twice. And in both cases, the owner just fired the people in charge and brought them back. Here's a picture of these women at the Lowell boarding house. Same place that you're watching the movie of. This is the company homes that they were required to live in. Homes where they paid rent to the factory with pay they received from the factory. Tell me how this is much different than slavery. I mean, I guess there is the point. They had the right to leave. They could quit. Okay. They wouldn't be beaten or killed. They weren't considered property, though perhaps they were treated as property.
Won't be long now. I think 'tis best you stay home tomorrow.
If I don't work, I don't get paid.
Aye. And if you drop dead, you don't get paid either.
I have to go out.
What? Where are you going, child?
I'm eating.
But you're sick.
Shan't be long.
Mary, wait!
I'm all right, Sean. 'Tis a simple cough.
It is not the cough that worries me. You're going to that Labour meeting, aren't you?
I can't stop thinking about Clarissa. Mr. Fowler never even bothered to turn off the machine.
Clarissa was too vain to pin her hair, and you said so yourself.
But accidents like that happen all the time in the mill. Just last week, some poor girl got 2 fingers snapped off the machine.
She was careless.
No, she was tired. We're all tired. It's all we can do to stay awake. It could have been me.
And what about the list?
I'll be careful.
Well, now, where do you think you're going?
Kindly let us pass.
Irish belong in the egg. Can you hear me?
Step aside.
I said Irish belong in the egg.
Sean! No! Sean!
Quite the assortment of battle scars you're collecting.
That'll teach me for leaving my shillelagh back in Ireland.
Evening, ma'am. We're looking for Sean Reardon.
For what?
Accessory to murder.
Murder?
You were involved in a brawl tonight. One of the boys was hit in the head with a rock. A short while ago, he died from the injury.
I did not throw any rocks.
'Tis true, he didn't.
Well, that's not what the witnesses say, so you'll have to come along. Come on!
I did not kill anyone!
Officers, please!
Now, the story of the first strike ended badly. 800 people organized on 2 occasions at that factory, and both times they failed. Because they were unskilled workers. Because stack of applications in the back, and the fact that it takes a day to train new people. Where the movement became effective was when we began to see skilled workers, artisans, form unions, allying themselves with unskilled workers. For example, I have a friend who's an electrician. He's a part of a national union. It means he can go to work anywhere in the country as an electrician. He lives in Ohio, he sometimes comes here, works part-time, enjoys the area, and then goes back home. Since he's part of this union, he can do that. But he's a skilled worker. You and I start messing with wires, we'll get shocked and kill ourselves. He can rewire a house or a car, you name it. If it's got electricity, he can fix it. That's a skilled profession. He's been doing it for a very long time. He's not easily replaceable. If he quits, someone's going to try to convince him to stay. If that union organizes and goes on strike, we're in big trouble as a country. We need those people. Stack of applications doesn't apply to the skilled workers. By the 1830s and 1840s, there were very few people that had organized into unions. In fact, only really 1% to 2% of workers in the United States had organized. However, these people that had organized had already employed the strike dozens of times. Often, especially in the case of unskilled workers, employers would hire immigrants to replace skilled workers. This happened so often, these immigrants were called scabs. People coming off the boat from Ireland, Scotland, didn't matter where, Russia, Poland, etc. And they were desperate for work. And they come into a town like Boston, needing work, fresh off the boat, got to find a place. Well, guess who's hiring? The mills. Why? Because there's a strike going on. Well, they don't have the luxury of being political. They just have to have a job. As immigration increased in the United States throughout the mid-1800s, we see immigrants cluster into various places. For example, Germans clustered in the upper Mississippi Valley. Throughout the Ohio River Valley, you can find a lot of German names in that part of the country. We also see another wave of Irish immigrants, like the story that we're watching, settling in many large eastern cities, such as New York or Boston. In fact, the Boston police force today is still primarily Irish. The Irish immigrants tended to be Catholic, tended to be poor. Many were coming over here because of a famine that had killed over 1 million people due to starvation in Ireland, and coming here desperate, needing a new place and opportunity. And were willing to work for low pay, because that's often the story of immigrants coming here in the United States, is that they have been willing to take jobs for lower pay out of desperation. And yet I've heard so much conversation this election about people looking down on immigrants. So much nasty rhetoric about immigration. And yet we've forgotten this fact, that many of our families came here in the early and mid-1800s under the same conditions. This engraving shows immigrants in 1848 arriving from Europe. You see Irish, you see Scottish, you see Anglos, you see etc.
Hi. I heard about your friend, Sean. They're saying it doesn't look good for him.
Oh, it'll be all right. Once I get the police to listen to me, they'll let him go.
Most of the boys have identified him as the rock thrower.
He threw no rocks. I was with him. On my way to your meeting, I was.
Mary, listen to me.
In America, everyone has a voice. They'll have to listen to me.
Yes, that's true. He has a right to a fair trial. But those boys come from very wealthy families, and they will see to it the finest prosecutors are assigned to the case. Mary, even if they do listen to you, they'll start asking questions about what you were doing that night and where you were going. If the company finds out...
My name will surely go on the list. Aunt Nara? What's wrong?
It's from Ireland. From Father Mullaney.
No, this can't be. I only have a few more weeks till I have enough money for the passage.
Oh, shut it.
It's not enough to cover his bail, much less hire a decent attorney. I wish to God there was more I could do for him. I'm his only family in America.
We're all Sean's family.
Mary, I can't tell you how saddened I was to learn of your ma and dad's passing.
They would want me to use it for what is right.
That they would, child. I'll give my savings as well. And then we'll hire the finest attorney in all of Lowell.
Now, the old slogan of the United Farm Workers was "United we stand, divided we fall." You see, you can fire an individual. Heck, you can fire a whole factory and replace them. But the movement continued to grow. People unionized throughout the 1830s. Trade unions formed, uniting to standardize wages. If everyone in an entire industry joined together, they could collectively bargain for better rights. They could collectively bargain for better working conditions. And these rights that we have as workers were fought for and bled for and died for, just like these rights that we have as Americans. By 1834, the very first National Trades Union had formed. But yet, the owners of these factories were no fools. They also organized. And it became a long-standing war between workers and owners. But the workers had much of the power. Sometime you need to read People's History of the United States. You'll hear the side of the workers, the side of the people, and their story told and emphasized. We'll use excerpts from that book throughout this class. Because you see, these rights that we have, that we take for granted, did you know the weekend was the result of years of fighting and strikes and people getting fired and beaten so that we could have a weekend? And now we don't even think about it. We're just like, oh yeah, weekend. Cool. That's when I do fun things. No, that was fought for. That was bled for. And people died for those weekends. You're like, what am I doing this weekend? Now, typically, the courts, the government, would rule in favor of the owners of these companies because they had the money. They could buy the influence. However, the labor movement started to see real success. By 1842, Massachusetts Supreme Court upheld workers' rights to strike. Yet, by the time of the Civil War, there were only 5,000 members of unions around the United States. And they could count on and rally about 20,000 workers in our country to go on strike if necessary. Enough to have small local success, but not enough yet to make a national difference. But this is the beginning of a movement that would result in things like a weekend, or minimum wage, or an 8-hour work week, or the right to feel safe at work. Basic things that you take for granted, people have fought for.
Together our money was enough to post Sean's bail, and although we didn't have enough left to hire the finest attorney in Lowell, he was certainly a man of sound reputation. He instructed Sean to waive his right to a jury trial, hoping the judge would be more impartial. Jury or not, prosecutor was skilled.
And is the boy who threw the rock in this room?
That's him right there.
And is the boy who threw the rock sitting in this courtroom?
To be sure, 'twas not going well for Sean.
No further questions? The people call Mary Driscoll to the stand.
can do it, quiet one. Make your voice be heard.
Now, do you swear to tell the truth?
Yes.
Now, you were with Sean the night of the brawl, is that correct?
Yes, I was beside him the whole time.
And did you see him take part in the fight in any way?
No, he was just trying to defend himself when the other boys started beating on him.
Did he throw any stones during this time?
Not a one.
You're certain of that?
Yes. As I said before, I was beside him the whole time. I would have seen if he had thrown a stone.
Now, this all happened very late in the evening. Do you mind me asking what exactly it is that you were doing out on the streets at that time?
I was on my way to a meeting, and Sean was trying to convince me not to go to it.
A meeting? What kind of meeting?
A labor meeting.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
In the matter of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Sean Reardon, the court finds the defendant not guilty of the crime of accessory to murder.
Aunt Nora said later the judge saw in my face an honesty he did not see in the boys. Annie said 'twas because I was willing to jeopardize my job, and that's why the judge believed my testimony.
Thank you so much, Mr. Quinn.
Thank you, Uncle. 1,000 thank yous will not be enough for all you've done for me.
I'm just glad the truth was heard.
Mary, where have you been? My coach leaves in less than an hour.
Mr. Fowler asked me to stay after my shift so that he could dismiss me and inform me that my name has been placed on the list.
Oh, Mary.
So I did, right there on the list, my name. And right next to it, the description, willful.
Aye, that's a good word for you. And proud you should be to wear it. Are you sure you won't come out west with me? Plenty of opportunities out there, even for we Irish.
No. Thanks all the same, but I like it here well enough.
Where will you find work?
I don't know. Not in a mill, that's for certain. I'm sure I'll find something.
That you will, Mary Driscoll. I'll never forget you. Like family we are. Always will be. Goodbye, all.
All right. What do you think? What was the main reason most immigrants avoided the South in the 1800s?
Yeah, they couldn't find love.
So that was based in Massachusetts, by the way. So on a different note, in the South, good. Slavery. I mean, okay, conditions sucked in these factories, but they weren't slaves. And not too many people, I mean, yeah, there's that.
Now you have heard of women's rights and how we've tried to reach new heights. If we're all created equal, that's us too. Yeah, but you will probably not recall that it's not been too long at all since we even had the right to cast a vote. Well, sure, some men bowed down and called us misses. Yeah. Let us hang the wash out and wash the dishes. But when the time rolled around to elect a president, what did they say, sister? What did they say? They said, see you later, alligator. And don't forget my mashed potatoes, cause I'm going downtown to cast my vote for president. Oh, we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. Then the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Oh, yeah. And now we pull down on the lever, cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Those pilgrim women who braved the boat could cook the turkey, but they could not vote. Even Betsy Ross, who showed the flag, was left behind that first election day. What a shame, sisters! Then Susan B., Anthony, yeah, and Julia Howe, Lucretia Mott, and others. They showed us how they carried signs and marched in lines until at long last the law was passed. Oh, we were suffering until suffrage. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. Then the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Oh, yeah. And now we cool down on the lever, cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Yeah. Yes, the 19th Amendment